Welcome to the Kick the Habit Forever podcast. My name is Michael Quirk. I'm a licensed therapist, coach, and educator. I've spent the last 25 years working with high-performing men, helping them to break free of the addictions, compulsion, bad habits, painful symptoms, and skills deficits that hold them back. If you're a high-performing man and your goal is to get control over your porn use, then this podcast is for you. Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about an issue that's becoming increasingly prevalent in our society. And that's especially the case given the rise of digital media and the easy access that we all have to the internet. Today we're going to be talking more about pornography addiction. This is a topic that can be a bit uncomfortable to address, but it's one that we have to confront head on if we're going to understand its far-reaching implications on both us as individuals and on our society as a whole. In our modern world, the consumption of pornographic material is more accessible than it probably ever has been before. What used to be considered taboo and used to be something that was difficult to obtain is now just a click away. In fact, we carry around phones that give us instant access to adult content, and that's available 24/7, and it's available on multiple devices. This unprecedented availability of pornography has given rise to some new patterns of consumption. And for some of us, the development of compulsive behaviors has gone right along with that. And that's what we're categorizing as porn addiction. During today's talk, I'm going to delve into the complex and multifaceted impacts of pornography addiction. I'm going to be exploring its effects on our brains, on our mental health, on our relationships, and on our overall well-being. We're going to talk about the societal implications and the importance of understanding this issue in order to provide effective support and intervention. So whether you're here out of personal interest, whether you're here out of professional curiosity, or whether you're here because you have a desire to help somebody that you know and that you care about, I hope that our talk provides valuable insights for you into the profound consequences of pornography addiction. So how about we start out by defining pornography addiction? And as I said, pornography addiction is what I consider to be an important modern challenge. Like other forms of addiction, it involves a compulsive behavior pattern that's categorized by an inability to control the use or the viewing of pornographic material, despite experiencing adverse consequences. So despite harm, will go on anyway. This behavior goes beyond casual or occasional viewing. That's not what I'm talking about here. And it's behavior that really becomes persistent. It becomes a recurring activity, and it interferes with your daily life and your responsibilities. Here are three key aspects of pornography addiction. So one, we're talking about consumption that's compulsive. We're talking about an overwhelming urge to consume pornographic material. Often, this increases in frequency and intensity over time. Number two, we're talking about a loss of control, the inability to reduce or stop consumption despite your attempts to do so. Number three, we're talking about negative consequences, and we're also highlighting continued use, even when it's causing you personal, relationship, and perhaps professional harm. So, one might wonder, what makes something an addiction? Now, we could talk for hours about that, and we could actually have a very high level academic um, discussion about that. But that's not what I'm interested in today. What I know is that my clients tell me that they feel like they are addicted. So the distinction here lies in the fact that your use of pornography interferes with the ability to function normally or to function how you want to in various aspects of your life. This might include things like perhaps you neglect your responsibilities, or your porn use is damaging your relationships, or perhaps porn use is causing you financial harm or legal problems. It's essential to know that not every single person who consumes pornography is going to develop an addiction. That's not what happens. But more, it's that it becomes compulsive or disordered or stuck when it starts to control the way you run your life rather than the other way around. Let's talk about the neurological impact of the porn habit and how it rewires the brain. One of the most profound impacts of pornography addiction occurs in our brain. Neuroscientific research has shown that consuming pornography can indeed alter our brain structures and functions. And this is much like substances such as drugs and alcohol do. The brain is a complex organ and it adapts to repetitive behaviors. That's one of the big things that shapes the way our brains work. And pornography consumption is no exception to this. So, when a person views pornography, the brain releases high levels of dopamine. Now, that's a transmitter that's associated with pleasure, seeking, and reward. This dopamine surge creates a sense of pleasure, euphoria, delight, similar to what one might experience if you engage in other pleasurable activities. However, what happens is when you're repeatedly exposed to this cycle, your brain begins to adapt to these elevated levels of dopamine. And this adaptation can cause problems. And it can lead to what we call desensitization. And what I mean is that over time, the brain becomes less and less sensitive to dopamine. And so that means that it requires more intense or more novel stimuli to achieve the same level of pleasure that you used to get. And this is why many of my clients tell me that they find themselves seeking out increasingly explicit content and sometimes increasingly extreme material. So they go places that they never thought that they'd go. And that's because they're driven by this adaptation, this desensitization, or this habituation that occurs with repeated use. Now, another concern is tolerance. So, in some ways, very similar to drug addiction, some people find that they need to consume more and more pornography, more extreme types, as I was just talking about. And they do that in order to achieve the same effect that they used to get from less explicit or less extreme material. Now, some of my clients talk about a kind of hyperreactivity. What do I mean by this? I mean that our brains become hyper responsive to cues related to pornography. So the other day, I was talking with somebody who's actually pretty far along in his recovery, and he referred to it as bugging out. How he used to walk down the street or go into a store and he would see somebody attractive and he would bug out. He would just feel locked on, obsessed with checking out that person and scanning their body. And he said he felt like it was a physical addiction for him. So, what we're talking about here is situations like the following. Sometimes a seemingly innocent situation can trigger thoughts about pornography and urges for use, and that can make it difficult for you to focus on the other tasks, the other responsibilities of living that you have. In essence, you get hooked and kind of hijacked. Compulsive use. Even when a person wants to stop watching porn, their brain's reward system can compel them to continue. And this is the place that addiction becomes deeply entrenched behaviorally. And that's because the brain is essentially, at this point, rewired or reconditioned to prioritize pornography viewing. The impact on our brains, it's not merely limited to changes in how we experience pleasure, but it can also affect the way our brains work. It can affect our cognitive functions. So, for example, excessive pornography use has been linked to reduced gray matter in areas of our brain that are related to decision making and impulse control. And this is one of the things that makes it harder for some people to exercise self control. And you can see how this can lead to a vicious cycle of addiction and compulsion. Now, beyond physical changes in our brain, there are also psychological and emotional consequences to porn addiction. Beyond the physical neurological impact, pornography addiction can have significant psychological and emotional consequences. These effects often show up as feelings of guilt that are repetitive, or feelings of shame that are, it's as if they're on a loop, or anxiety, fear, depression, frustration, and irritability. Again, just feelings that loop. Let's talk about some of the key psychological impacts in a little bit more detail. Let's talk about guilt and shame first. Many individuals who are struggling with pornography addiction, they experience intense guilt and shame about their behavior. This is something that I hear probably every single day. And these guys may feel as if they're engaging that's something that's really not in keeping with their values, something that's morally wrong, something that they're aware is not very socially acceptable. And this leads them to a kind of negative self image. And it creates a cycle where they turn to porn to escape these very feelings, only again to feel worse afterwards. And this is very common in the cycle of addiction of any kind. There's also anxiety and depression. The compulsive nature of the addiction can lead to a chronic stress, a chronic anxiety. One of the things that I hear from a lot of guys is that they worry about being caught, and they worry about how their addictive behavior is affecting their relationships. And frankly, they just flat out worry about their ability to stop at all. Depression is pretty common, as this porn addiction can lead to a sense of helplessness, a sense of hopelessness, powerlessness, and despair. One of the big concerns, one of the big effects of chronic porn use is that often there's a distorted perception of intimacy and sexuality that gets cultivated through viewing pornography. And that's because adult content often depicts men and women with in a kind of unrealistic and exaggerated portrayal of what sexuality and relationships actually are. Regular consumption can distort an individual's understanding of intimacy, sexuality, and it can lead to an unrealistic expectation of your real life relationships. This can cause a kind of chronic dissatisfaction. It can feel frustration when reality does not match the idealized versions that you see in pornography. Now, one of the common things I hear, again, I probably hear this every single day, is that repeated porn use, especially compulsive porn use, erodes your self esteem. Constantly turning to pornography can erode self-esteem, particularly if you're the kind of individual that feels as if you're already not living up to your own or other people's expectations in life. The inability to control the addiction can lead to a sense of inadequacy, a sense of being a failure. Many men have with me about how their porn addiction has made them feel as if they are broken or that there's something fundamentally not okay with them. Another effect of chronic porn use is that other addictive behaviors can increase right alongside. And that's because those guys who are struggling with pornography addiction may be more susceptible to other forms of addiction. So I'm talking about things like substance abuse, drug, alcohol use, gaming, gambling. Many of my clients struggle with online gaming that feels out of control to them. And they use these behaviors as a means of coping with the negative associations that get created by their out of control porn use. Now, our social and relationship, there are important social and relationship ramifications. And these are kinds of the ripple effect of compulsive pornography use. The impact of pornography addiction extends beyond just us as individuals, and it extends to our social environment and our relationships. This is one of the areas where I see the effects can actually be most damaging. And that's because it not only affects the person, but it affects all their loved ones, their friends, their family, their partners. One of the effects that's also pretty difficult to deal with is the way that adult content addiction damages intimacy and creates trust issues with you and other people. I'd say that's one of the most significant impacts is the way porn addiction affects intimate relationships. So many of the partners of the guys I work with who are struggling with porn addiction, they feel betrayed, they feel hurt, sometimes they feel humiliated, but almost always they feel disconnected. The addiction leads to decreased sexual interest and intimacy, and the addicted individual often ends up preferring pornography use over real life interaction. Now, as you can imagine, this leads to another effect, and that's communication breakdown. Pornography addiction often leads to secrecy. It leads to sneaking around. It leads to lies for many people. And the secrecy and lies erode trust. They destroy open communication. They create hiding in relationships. Many times I hear that my clients' partners feel excluded, they feel rejected, and they struggle to understand why their loved one is choosing pornography over them. You can imagine how devastating and hurtful that is. There can also be an emotional withdrawal that takes place when one is compulsively using pornography or adult content. That's because as the addiction progresses, which is often the case, you might become more emotionally withdrawn from your partner. You might withdraw from your friends. You might avoid your family. You might spend more and more time in isolation. You might spend increased time avoiding basic social interaction and the responsibilities of day-to-day life. And you might do that just because you end up preferring or prioritizing your addiction. Now, as I've said earlier, of course, this impacts you greatly. It can impact parenting. It can impact family dynamics in a devastating way. For the guys I work with that have children, pornography addiction can definitely impact their parenting. I have heard this time and time again. The addicted individual ends up being less present, often less patient, more irritable, and their use affects the overall family dynamic and the emotional well-being of the children. It's kind of like the other day, somebody told me that he was aware of how much time he was spending around his kids, actually picking up his phone and taking a quick peek at porn while he was sitting there taking care of them. So not only did it disturb him, but he was starting to notice how dad being tuned out and distracted all the time was really affecting his toddlers. Earlier, I mentioned social isolation. Let's get back to that for a moment. This addiction takes hold. As it takes hold, you might begin to isolate yourself from regular social activities, from relationships in general. And this very isolation can exacerbate your feelings of loneliness and depression. And it can create a kind of vicious cycle that can be quite challenging to break. Compulsive porn use can impact your personal well-being and also your daily functioning. This addiction can affect your well-being and your day-to-day functioning in a bunch of different ways. It's not just about the time that you spend consuming porn, but it's about the broader effects on various aspects of life. So, for example, there are more than a few guys who've told me that their productivity at work has sunk and that they've even had problems with their work performance and gotten called on the carpet for it. Struggling with pornography addiction can create difficulties concentrating. It can get in the way of staying focused at work or at school. I've even had guys tell me that their basic work performance has fallen off a cliff because they find themselves getting distracted, spending so much time surfing the internet, looking at pornographic images, or even leaving the workplace. One gentleman that I worked with would regularly leave to go to his car during the middle of the workday. He'd go to his car to view porn. So I don't think I have to spell out any further how this can lead to decreased productivity and potential disciplinary actions at work. Now, more than one guy has talked with me about the financial consequences he's facing because of his porn use. That's because spending significant amounts of money on subscriptions, webcam sessions, OnlyFans, paid AI pornography, other pornographic services can really add up. Over time, this can create a lot of financial strain. It can create debt. It can even create legal issues if the behavior crosses certain boundaries or if you go into a debt hole that you can't actually dig yourself out of. Sometimes porn use affects a person's physical health. Prolonged periods of porn consumption can contribute to physical health issues. Now, I've seen this be the case where porn use leads to obesity, to just poor posture, lack of exercise, decreased overall fitness. I've had more than one guy tell me that they get inadequate or disturbed sleep because their porn use interferes with their sleep-wake cycle so much. The stress and lack of sleep associated with addiction can weaken our immune systems, and it can lead to a host of other health problems. Now, overall, porn addiction can create a reduced engagement in your overall life activities. As this addiction grows, as it consumes more of your time and more of your energy, you might find yourself disengaging from hobbies, from working out, from interests and activities that you once enjoyed, from recreational activities. This reduction in meaningful engagement can further contribute to feeling depressed, feeling stressed out, feeling emotionally reactive, and overall feeling dissatisfied with your life. And that can create a big impact on mental health. So if you've got a pre-existing mental health condition, so if you're a man who's dealing with anxiety, if you're dealing with a mood problem like depression, then pornography addiction can exacerbate these issues. It can increase the risk of developing new mental health problems as the addiction takes its toll on your emotional and psychological state. Now, earlier I mentioned that there are societal implications to the increasing problems that we have with porn addiction. Let's take a broader perspective. While our focus up till now has been on you as an individual, I also think it's important to recognize that we have broader societal implications when it comes to pornography addiction. This addiction, it doesn't only affect us as just sole individuals, it affects families, it affects communities, and it is really affecting our societal norms. One of the ways it does that is that much of pornography use normalizes harmful behaviors. The widespread availability and the consumption of pornography can contribute to the normalization of behaviors that are unsafe and that are unrealistic when it comes to typical human sexual behavior and the expectations that we should really have of ourselves and each other. This impacts society's views on all sorts of topics like consent, intimacy, and what healthy sexual behavior actually is. Compulsive porn use can create public health concerns, and it can be considered a public health concern due to its potential to contribute to mental health issues, as I mentioned, to relationship breakdowns, as we've talked a little bit about, and even to increased rates of sexually transmitted infections. And that's if your porn use has led you into the realm of taking risky sexual behaviors. Now, one of the things I've seen in my practice has been that compulsive porn use has really impacted young people. The accessibility of pornography to younger folks is particularly concerning to me. I have so many people, especially guys in their 20s and 30s, that told me that they started compulsively viewing adult content when they were very young. I'm talking 10, 11, 12 years old. And many of these people grew up in households where there was open acceptance of pornography viewing. They watched their parents, or they knew that their parents regularly engaged in watching pornography. This early exposure to porn can influence the development of our attitudes towards sex. It can shape our opinions about relationships, and it can deeply affect our self-image. And from what I've seen, this can often lead to problems in adulthood. There's economic impact. We could talk about that. There is a loss of productivity in our society due to addiction, due to the ways that the addiction it affects how we work and what we get done and how focused we are, how much we accomplished. This, of course, affects businesses, whether we're a business owner or an employee, and it affects our overall economic growth as a nation. So now let's talk about how to address pornography addiction and a potential path forward for you. Given the significant impacts that I've been talking about regarding pornography addiction, it's crucial that we address it in a thoughtful and an effective way. Here are some strategies that I want you to think about. These are some ideas about how you can support yourself and your community. The first is what you're doing right now It's education and awareness, increasing awareness about the potential risks of pornography use and the signs of addiction, the signs that we've been talking about today, can help you recognize when you or someone you know might indeed need some help. There's therapeutic interventions, so professional therapy. Um, it can be very effective in helping you understand and change addictive behavior patterns. We've got support groups. They can provide guidance, they can provide a safe space, they can provide tips, methods, tools for you to use. They can provide a place for you to share your experience and learn strategies to overcome your addiction. And that's something that's very important. It's very important that you develop healthy, skillful coping strategies, strategies that cultivate well being. So I encourage you to develop healthy coping strategies. These can be things like exercise, mindfulness based meditation, hobbies. They can all reduce and help you manage stress. They can help, and that in turn can help you reduce your reliance on pornography use. Now, it's also important that partners and families of people who are addicted to pornography get support. So, if that's you, getting support is crucial. Again, there's therapy, there's support groups. These can help you process your feelings and also help you to develop strategies for coping with all the disappointment, frustration, and fear that you might have about your loved one's porn addiction. Now, I don't want to get too far into this, but it is important that we think about policies and perhaps regulations in this area. There might be a role for policies limiting access to pornography. Many of the people that I mentioned in my practice really had free access to pornography as children, and that ended up damaging them. Now I know uh, there are already existing regulations and such about that. But, as a culture, that's something that is worth thinking about. Another thing I think is very important is there's a lack of information, there's an ignorance, and there's a lot of misinformation. I see that particularly in my clients who have porn addiction. They often have wildly um, inaccurate information about sexuality in general. And so I think it's important that we promote education about healthy sexuality and the potential risks involved in sexuality in general and pornography use in particular. So let's start to wrap up here and let's talk about moving towards understanding and healing for yourself. Pornography addiction is complex. It's a multifaceted issue. It has far-reaching impacts on you as an individual. It affects your relationships, and as I was just talking about, it really is affecting our society as a whole. It's affecting not only the way your brain functions, but it also affects your emotional well-being, your social connections, and the quality of your social relationships, as well as the overall quality of your life. If you address this issue, it's going to require a comprehensive approach, one that includes education for you, support, and helpful, skillful expertise and intervention. So, as you move forward, I want you to continue the conversation about pornography addiction in a way that is compassionate towards yourself and non judgmental. And that doesn't mean colluding or giving in, it just means not beating yourself up um, for your compulsive use. That's rarely, if ever, helpful. If you increase your understanding, if you provide yourself with support, then what I know is that you can heal and you can thrive. So I want to thank you for your time. I appreciate that you listened to me today. And my hope is that the things that I've talked about have provided you with some value, with some insight into the way that porn addiction might be impacting your life and the life of the important people around you. Thanks for listening today. I'd like to invite you to view my free class. It's called How to Kick the Habit Forever. In it, we talk about what you have to do in order to unhook yourself from compulsively using adult content. Go to www.kickthehabitforever.com now to view it.